Well, thank you so much for inviting me back. It was wonderful to be at the NICHC Conference a few months ago. So I've been practicing for about 34 years as a naturopathic physician. I started in cancer research over 42 years ago. So I'd like to talk to you about some of the health benefits and health issues with cannabis. Just give you a quick tutorial. Now, I've got quite a lot of slides on this presentation, more than I can actually show you this morning in detail. So I'll go through the first half more or less normally, but the last half we'll breeze through and just touch on some highlights. I wanted to put together a full presentation for those who want to pick it up later, email me, or to get it from the host to look at things in more detail. But I'll just capture the highlights of the last part. So bear with me on that, please. So I really am very grateful to be here on Algonquin territory and to speak to all these notable people in this room who have such a keen interest in this wonderful plant. And so it has a long history of use, thousands of years as a medicinal and spiritual plant in Africa, Middle Asia, and throughout a great part of the world, China, India, and gradually through Europe and spread through North America as well, and grew, various varieties grew wild here at one point. And it was found to be in competition mainly with the cotton and oil industries and associated with people of color, and therefore the industrialists of the day had to do something about it. And they passed laws against it by starting to tax it heavily to the point where it was non-viable commercially for hemp, and eventually became classed as a narcotic with no acceptable medical use, even under medical supervision. Now, we all know that this is a great lie, and it's been exposed, and the people have pushed and pushed and brought this to where it's now become legalized in Canada because of the grassroots movement behind it, of people believing in it and using it and finding benefit in it. And these are some of the things that it does, and that obviously the government had some interest, I suppose, in suppressing. Being able to sit with your own thoughts and to relax and to feel at one with nature and so forth. And while it has many benefits in these areas, it has no long-term cancer risk or cognitive risk with at least reasonable use. Like any plant, it can be abused. People abuse tobacco, the most spiritual plant. But this plant has been abused, but more abused by authority than by people using it, I think. So these are some of the medical and health issues that are approved and one can apply for medical use of cannabis. Quite a lot of very important conditions that I know people in this room suffer for and your family suffer from. There are many things that we can do with this. I lectured on it, for example, for PTSD at the naval base out in Esquimalt, near Victoria where I live, and they're now giving it to some sailors under certain conditions. So it has many uses. It began to be used for cachexia and wasting and loss of appetite in AIDS from the time AIDS first appeared, etc. Cancer and all these other wonderful indications. But please remember that there's only cell and rodent research. There's really no human trials of any significance for these conditions. This is all mainly anecdotal use. But I've met many patients in my decades of practice who have benefited from this plant for these kind of conditions. Very interesting uses in helping people taper off opioids. I have a drug, low-dose Otrexon, I prescribe for cancer. I think it's one of the most wonderful things I've been able to prescribe. And I have to get people off of opiates to give it to them. It's an opiate blocker. And if people are on moderate doses of opiates and get onto cannabis and use it appropriately and get off of the opiates, then I can give them this potentially life-saving medication. So this has been a keen interest of mine. I published a review paper of some articles showing that in places where it's legalized, opiate use and overdoses decline and associated crime declines. We've certainly seen a number of people who are using it to get more rapidly off of opiates, and the more they reduce the dose, the less risk of overdose and other problems. So it's not a drug. It used to be called a gateway drug, that you smoke pot, then you'll be snorting coke, and next thing you know, you'll be shooting heroin. But in actuality, it's an exit drug. It helps people get off of these kind of heavier drugs that exert a heavier toll on their health and on society. And how it all works is because we have this marvelous, absolutely stupendously awesome system in our body called the endocannabinoid system. We have these two chemicals that help regulate almost every system in your body: your immune system, your digestion, your neurological system, your cardiovascular system. All of these are regulated by cannabinoids. And these naturally occur. They belong to us. They're part of our natural inheritance. They don't belong to the government or anyone else. The endocannabinoids are working in your system right now, helping you stay steady Eddie, nice and smooth through your day. So they're anandamine. Now, ananda comes from the Sanskrit word bliss. It was considered the bliss molecule. And when you get lots of this going on, you feel pretty comfortable, pretty at ease, pretty relaxed. And 2-isoglycerol. And both of these have various receptors that they plug into. And I haven't gone into detail on the receptors here, but they're in every part of your body, including on your immune cells and all the systems of your body. In fact, there's more of these endocannabinoid receptors in your body than are opiate receptors. And the cannabinoids from the cannabis plant and other plants and other possible sources interact with these two. So we don't actually ingest these chemicals. We have these already in us. But the ones that we can ingest from cannabis, for example, will interact with these. So CBD, cannabidiol, very well known now as coming from hemp and doesn't get you high, can make you very relaxed, but doesn't get you high, will actually stop the clearance. It'll like dam up the creek and allow the anandamine to build up in your body. At the same time, it'll actually stimulate the release of the other endocannabinoid. So CBD acts through two completely different mechanisms on these two cannabinoids to bring both of them up in your body. So it doesn't cause you to make more, but it causes you to release or to stop getting rid of the cannabinoids. And all the cannabinoids have these kind of interactions with these two key chemicals. So there are many, many cannabinoids. Different textbooks say different things. So it's somewhere between 68 and 108 is my best estimate. But who knows, others may be discovered in the future. The ones that we think are most important are here: THC, this is the narcotic, this is what gets people high. And CBD, now very famous, originally for use with epilepsy in children, little Charlotte's Web, you may have heard the story. And CBG and so forth. And then there's the terpenes. These are the aromatic oils, the things that give the different flavors and scents. You can have strawberry kush, and you can have, strawberry shortcake indica, and different things that have a strawberry smell, other ones that have a pine smell, a lemon smell, this sort of thing. And these are what the dogs used to sniff out when they're sniffing out cannabis at the airport. And then there's flavonoids that probably have minor health benefits as well. So there's a lot of bioactives in this plant. It's a very rich plant in terms of medical properties. THC being the most well known, and this is what gets people high, and it's very, very good for nausea in chemotherapy, for example. And despite lack of real good human data, this has been widely accepted by oncologists. ADHD, tumor growth, pain. Now, tumor growth, very controversial. Certainly, there's some case studies. I helped edit one that's been published, but there's not, no clinical trials on this, please keep in mind. So, a doctor at Women's Hospital in Vancouver starts her clients on about 1.5 milligrams. That's a very conservative dose. Most people can start at about 5 milligrams, but 10 is enough to get people pretty stoned. If they're not used to it, they're going to be uncomfortable at 10 milligrams. So we start usually at bedtime with a very small dose and build it up. And whatever problems people may have from it often settle down in about 2 to 3 days, sometimes 4 days. And then people can bump the dose up. So real important principle in dosing THC, go low and slow, start at bedtime, and don't be in too big a hurry to get it up to higher dose. Probably about 50, 100 milligrams is an effective dose for most problems. Now, in the old days, Rick Simpson, people were taking 600, 800 milligrams a day of THC and being absolutely gooned, and just really inappropriate use of it. So it turns out that with the original Rick Simpson oil, I've tested a number of varieties, about 1,000 times more THC than CBD. But nowadays, the oils are often equal parts. So it really changed that ratio by 3 orders of magnitude. Huge difference. Really brought down the THC. And we can get the results with that we used to get with big dose THC because the other cannabinoids contribute. They're synergistic. They work complementary. way. So this has allowed more people to tolerate this drug, is by adding these other components and taking advantage of the fact that they like to work together, they should work together. So some of the common side effects: dry mouth and dizziness, racing heart, some anxiety. Women especially tend to feel a little more anxious and paranoid on this than men, as a general rule. And there's other minor issues that can happen. Bloodshot eyes, pretty common. The old smoke a joint, get some Visine out trick before your parents see you. One interesting thing here is that these side effects of THC are very much aggravated by MSG, so they call it Dorito syndrome. Kids get the munchies and sit and have a toke and eat Doritos, and then they're really, really whacked. So be careful about that. The traditional remedies in Africa and Asia and Afghanistan, for example, where I was back in the 70s, if a kid, say, eats a big piece of hash, they'll give them citrus juice or pine nuts. They'll put black pepper in hot water and have them drink it, or use calamus root. These are the traditional remedies. But something very, very useful for you to know: if people are trying to bring up the dose of THC for pain or cancer or any other purpose, you can take this product called citicoline. AOR makes it out in Calgary. And it's used mainly for memory problems. But you take a capsule of this, one or two capsules an hour before the THC, and the buzz is much better handled for people, so people can get up to the dose that's effective and get off of those opiates, whatever else they're trying to do with this. So this is a very useful tip. Citicoline about an hour before THC makes the high much more manageable. CBD became well known because of its effect on epilepsy in a child, and there was a film made about Charlotte's Web, about a little girl named Charlotte who had intractable epilepsy, and this was the only thing that helped. Now, since then, other parents have been giving it to children and gotten locked up and their children taken away because they're giving them a narcotic. But if you had a child who had 50 seizures a day, I think you'd want to be doing this, or trying it at least. And the cannabidiol is in hemp, so you can have it that's completely THC-free, but it also grows in the hybrids, the sativas, and the indicas. And it's in the indica leaf as well. Some people are juicing the leaf, collecting the leaves left over from trimming in the various factories and juicing them up, and finding that's a very effective medicine for things like inflammation and nausea. IBD is irritable bowel disease, like colitis, muscle spasms, GVHD, graft versus host disease, rejection transplants in leukemia, for example, which my niece died of. This is dear to my heart. TBI, traumatic brain injury, very neuroprotective. It's useful in neurological diseases like Alzheimer's and Huntington's chorea, multiple sclerosis. So very neurologically active and helping with pain and spasm in MS and other diseases. Very, very useful substance, doesn't get people high. This is much more socially acceptable to most people. And the dose is usually starting about 5 to 10 milligrams, but that can be a couple times a day. You don't really want to start with more than about 40 milligrams the first day, I would suggest. Otherwise, you might find you're just so relaxed, you're not going to accomplish very much. But it doesn't get you really high and goofy, just very relaxed. So probably, again, a milligram per pound of body weight. So someone like myself that's 200 pounds in my dreams would take 200 milligrams. So per day as a maximum, and at least stop there and look around and see if that's sufficient. And often even half that dose is quite sufficient for most people. You can take up to perhaps 450 milligrams a day, but certainly beyond that, you're wasting your time. I would suggest that half that is a much more appropriate dose. And there is some thought that one of the world's most famous scientists working on cannabis in Israel has discovered that some CBD can convert to THC inside the stomach. That's an interesting new development. CBG, I've been testing oils that people are using for cancer, and we see an oil will work for someone and they'll get relief of various types. It'll put on weight, lose some of their pain, and maybe even have some tumor shrinkage. And then another batch won't work and they'll regress. And we found by testing the oils, even in this basically a crossover study going back and forth with one batch working, another batch not working, we found often the difference is the CBG, cannabigerol. So there's some mouse data that this is anti-tumor, and I'm seeing clinically and telling you anecdotally that I think this is as important as the others. And if we're going to use it for cancer, I definitely want to see some of the CBG in there. Unequivocally, the best results I've had are the oils that have the most CBG. And THC comes in the plant in the form of acid form, and when it's heated to process it or to smoke it or vape it, this decarboxylates. It takes off a little chemical group and makes it bioactive. The THCA is not going to get you high. So if you just take it and put it into, without much heat, into an oil or make a tincture and you don't ever heat it, it's going to be in this form. And there's actually quite a lot of evidence that this is good for spasms and tumors as well. So, and then there's the lesser cannabinoids, but some of the very, very strong sedatives, and we'll probably see more extracts and isolates of these in the future used and made into pharmaceuticals because they are quite potent when they're isolated. The terpenes, as mentioned before, are the aromatic oils that give the flavors and scents to the different products. And these help produce what we call the entourage effect, the synergistic effect of the whole plant extracts, that all these components add up. And so you don't have to have a real killer dose of THC anymore. What you have to have is a good mix of all the different bioactives at the same time for it to be very gentle yet effective. And there's many other plants that produce cannabinoids. So ginger root and flax and clove. Part of the reason why clove oil probably works for pain is the cannabinoid ingredients in it. But olive oil, now there's something interesting, a food that has influence on the endocannabinoid system. And flax oil probably the same. So what I can tell you is that I have seen it work clinically for nausea, vomiting, appetite, wasting, or cachexia, where people lose muscle and fat and become quite gaunt. It helps with sleep and anxiety and depression in some people. Now, there was a paper recently claiming that regular use in teenagers increases depression and even suicide. So talk to you a little bit later about keeping away from children. I think this is an important part of the new laws. And it does shrink some tumors. I have seen some effect, although this is exaggerated by a lot of sources. There are people who have had some results with this. And I'll show you a few cases if we can get the time. Just check my time here. There we go. So it's very good for all different types of pain. Pain in the organs, pain in the muscles, pain in the nerves, all different types of pain. And about 20 milligrams of THC equals about 120 milligrams of codeine, but usually with a little bit more cognitive effects. So it is said, and I have come around to believe that there are many, many instances where cannabis is not necessarily the most effective and most cost-effective and best tolerated drug of the different choices one could make for different types of pain. But nonetheless, we've seen many people who've gotten rid of a lot of dangerous drugs that are harming their gut or getting them addicted by switching to this medicine. And there's a number of papers that show that while CBD is very good for pain, that the synergy between THC and CBD should be exploited, that together for serious pain you really need both. It's very good in chemo for nausea and vomiting, and this has been very well recognized. I had a case where I was treating the person for nausea during chemo with Chinese herbs very effectively, but they were up country, they ran out, they forgot to order on time, so they called me and said, send some right away. And then they called back next day, never mind, my buddy gave me some pot butter, I put it on some toast, and I'm good. So it really can be very effective in very modest amounts in these edible forms. And of course, it helps with appetite, thus the munchies, and increases stomach emptying. This may be of some value in certain medical conditions of the stomach. And one thing I have found, and do warn people about, if you're taking the standard sort of chemo drugs, the poisonous chemo drugs, that more traditional ones that have been used over the last few decades, that if you take a high dose THC and get quite ill, I'm not sure, I believe it detoxifies us and purges the liver of some of these drugs and stirs them up and gets them back in circulation. And I really don't think people should be using really high-dose THC during chemo. I think it may interfere with the effectiveness of the chemo drugs, and it certainly doesn't make the patient more comfortable when you go past a certain point. So just during chemo, the minimum dose that deals with the nausea. And CBD also deals with nausea, so I would use a CBD-dominant oil in that circumstance. Now, there's just a lot of different moving parts to cancer, and it turns out the cannabinoids interact with a lot of them. The growth, the spread, the stemness. I just lectured on this in San Diego last weekend. Cancer stem cells, these are the ones that go dormant, the sleeper cells that you cannot kill with radiation and chemo. You want to stop the cancer cells from becoming stem cells, and this is one of the things that the cannabinoids can help do. So there's a number of different papers written here. I'll just flash through these quickly, showing it stops angiogenesis, for example, blood vessel growth into the tumor. Well, green tea does the same. And so does the drug Avastin or bevacizumab. But cannabinoids do have this impact. But please note that these are all from cell and rat studies. These are not big human trials. So on paper, it looks like a real tiger, but is it really? Well, it does a lot of useful things, and there is preclinical, as I say, non-human studies that show potential for lung and brain cancer, and I have seen this. I can vouch for this. I've seen cases that have been dramatically helped with cannabis. I've seen some responses in leukemia and carcinoids and other more rare cancers. It isn't useful for all cancers yet, in my opinion, but certainly some of them it's worth considering if people are in a corner running out of options. And there have been a little bit of human trials, but not very much. Now, the ALL case, we published this case. A lady was dying in a blast crisis of leukemia, got on cannabis, actually got home safe out of the ICU. Next batch didn't work, ended up back in the hospital, back in the intensive care unit, dying, hours away from dying. Scrambled and found another batch, got her well again. Next batch didn't work, and she died. And this was back in the day when homemade oils, the quality was up and down and completely unreliable. And so this was part of what we wrote, was that it may have potential in a case like this, but for God's sake, we've got to have quality, consistent, medical quality oils, which we're now seeing on the market. Rick Simpson started all this. He would say it cures 70% of stage 4 cancers and cures everything and never causes any harm, and there is no such medicine. Sorry, Rick, doesn't exist. But kudos to him for his courage in getting something started, making a solvent-extracted oil. And people would buy it in these syringes and take a grain of rice size bit of oil and work up to about a gram a day. But the oils were random. Some of them were full of mold, some of them were full of salmonella, some of them were hardly full of anything useful. Others were very potent. So certainly the original Rick Simpson oil, Phoenix Tears oil, when people use that term, to me it means nothing. It just means a solvent-extracted oil of very indeterminate quality. Now, anyone can go online and find stories like this about a brain cancer in a child that was cured putatively with cancer, but I don't know this case. I don't know if that was photoshopped. I don't know if they had chemo or radiation. All I know is it's an interesting story. But I photoshopped this one. I took the man's name off so you don't know who this patient is. But this is a very significant brain cancer that was completely cured with cannabis and no other medicine. So this is a real case. Someone who rolled into my office on a wheelchair and is now walking. So there's no denying there are these cases out there. They may be few and far between, but they exist. This is another, skip ahead. This is my most famous patient who asked me to promote that he took treatment and got on Fox News a couple years ago and said McKinney, but marijuana cured my cancer. So this is really what drew me into all of this. And he did have a great response. I also have a very dear friend who's alive and well, about 9 years past his expiry date. Took me out, caught my first salmon, fighting a carcinoid and unresponsive to conventional care and expected to die about 10 years ago, and doing pretty well. And we've seen him go up and down with different batches of oil. So this is the oil we're now having made, and you see the good over 1% CBG. This oil has just gotten right back in the pink. It's marvelous. Made in Vernon. The original drugs were all THC, 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 got people high as a kite. The new Sativex, only licensed in Canada, not very popular with patients. Smoking is for dopes. You waste a lot of product. Vaping is a lot better. About 30% more of the product gets into your blood, and less carbon monoxide and soot and other issues. So this is definitely a better way to go. This fellow with carcinoid, we got him started. Gave him some clones of a better variety than what he was using. He vaporized 6 ounces in 6 weeks, and his tumor shrank 50%. Then we got him to grow a room full of it and made oil, and he's been excellent pretty much ever since. Edibles, there's this great website, Ted Smith and group in Victoria have pioneered how to make various edibles, and a very useful website there. Hempology.ca, and CBC Canada, that's a rich one. A little infringement there on Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. But anyway, I better move on. So topical oils have been used as well. I've had some people vouch for them. I haven't really witnessed anything dramatic myself with them. People have used suppositories for cervical cancer, uterine cancer, vaginally, and use rectal suppositories for colon cancer and pelvic cancers, and have had some good results without getting high. And you can make your own, but now we've got a lot of the dispensaries manufacturing them in a more controlled way. And quick browse through, in using any medication, one should always know when not to use it and what problems you might anticipate. So certainly there are some conditions where we don't want people using it. And before age 19, the frontal cortex of the brain is not fully developed, the reasoning center, the part of the brain that understands consequences. So guess what? Teenage boys don't have much of this going on. And they'll ride on the hood of a car down the road, 60 miles an hour and do other foolish things. Well, it turns out that the reward centers that give you a buzz from drugs is well developed at those ages, but the reasoning center is not. So they can get real high, but then they don't know what to do with it, and it can get out of control. So there's no question that it does influence brain development in young people, especially in the 13, 14, 15-year-old group, and there is every reason to keep it away from these developing brains, if at all possible. People can take it for nausea and vomiting and then get super bad vomiting. One of the keynotes is they'll want heat, they'll want a hot pack on or a hot shower, and then they'll feel better, and remove the heat and they start vomiting again. So this will happen if people overuse it. It definitely can cause early onset psychosis in people who are susceptible. If there's a strong family history, you really shouldn't be taking it. There are references that say this is a bit of an illusion, but nonetheless, there have been known cases. It is a concern. Good hard science over the next few years hopefully will settle this issue, but it is a real caution at this time. We believe it's important. And it definitely can change the regulation of genes involved in brain development. There is some risk of dependence. It's much like tobacco. People get grumpy and ornery when they quit for about a week or two, and then they get over it. It's not very hard for most people to quit. N-acetylcysteine and some other medications can help people break these dependencies more easily, but it's not as addicting as some of the other drugs it replaces. Withdrawal symptoms are fairly minor. Do remember the people are being drug tested, the metabolites stay in the urine for up to 80 days. So you can't just have a toke on the weekend and expect to clear the drug test on Monday. And for that matter, a roadside check just might turn up something if you smoked weed the week before. So we'll see how that plays out in the courts. And it can have effect, very, very small increased risk of stroke. And if someone has racing heart atrial fibrillation, I'd be very cautious about this. Holding your breath can cause excess lung expansion and damage the lungs. This is approved by Tommy Chong. He So if you don't know, Tommy was put in prison for 18 months by this president, framed his son and then made him confess. Isn't associated with cancer according to many studies, but there are some studies that say there is a risk. So I don't happen to think this is very true. I've seen a lot of heavy pot smokers lifelong using it medicinally without any problems. I don't think this is a big deal, but the science is up back and forth on this. I have to think some of the results may be more political than medical. But there's very definitely problems with mold, especially making the oils, but you grow indoor plants, tight buds, the mold is a real issue, and we've seen some oils that make people really, really ill because of the mold content. And it will also grow salmonella and streptococcus, and we've seen oils that make people very ill from that as well. So this is why we started shaming, at least in the Victoria area, all the different compassion clubs to start testing the oils and making sure that they're clean and safe. And very definitely toxins, solvents, and pesticides are big issues. We have seen even some of the licensed growers now having recalls because of lapses in this. This is something that the government's trying to closely regulate and needs to closely regulate. And there are drug interactions. NSAIDs, things like ibuprofen, reduce the effectiveness of THC. It interferes with seizure medications. So this is interesting if you're trying to use it for epilepsy. So this requires some medical management and judgment. People shouldn't be trying these on their own, really. If you have a very serious medical problem, you should be having some medical guidance with this, as with any drug. And anticholinergic drug, things like drugs that have been used for the prostate to pee more freely, for example, and definitely interacts with sedatives, benzodiazepines, Ativan, sleep drugs, and alcohol, antidepressants. Big interactions with acetylcholine and mirtazapine, and some other drugs. So definitely worth knowing this, and you really should talk to a pharmacist or someone educated in this before you mix it with other prescription drugs. But I have to say that a lot of people have gotten off all the prescription drugs using cannabis. I saw in a film once, someone had a whole tray of different pharmaceuticals that they no longer take, they just use cannabis, and I've seen this in real life, that some people, it replaces half a dozen or a dozen of their drugs. So it can cause people to become paralyzed, particularly in concert with mirtazapine, an antidepressant, and people actually become frozen and unable to respond for some hours. It's quite disturbing for people around them, but quite harmless in the end. So it has many bioactives. There's lots going on in this plant. There's many things we can use. We're going to see more and more isolates and drugs made from it, but let's not let them turn this into another pharmaceutical at $5,000 a dose. If the price today causes financial toxicity to a lot of patients. So we want to see mass production, quality product, reasonable prices, and perhaps some subsidies for certain conditions in which it's showing itself to be indicated. And it definitely has value in a lot of neurological and disorders and gastrointestinal disorders and brain tumors, lung tumors. But it isn't always reliable, at least in the products out there currently, and there are adverse effects, and it is the least proven drug. There are no human trials. Some are getting started, and certainly Israel's leading in that respect. But you have to understand, this is all very experimental at this point. But thousands of years of use, and I've seen hundreds of patients benefit. I'm on board with this being used medically for a lot of conditions, and I think it's a wonderful opportunity to help our communities, to help ourselves be healthier and happier in this world. So thank you very much.